The rumor mill is starting, and NBA trade season is upon us, which makes it the perfect time to try to answer the question: should the Cavaliers make a trade? Should they have a trade season? Should they even consider one, given the way that they're playing? I've enlisted the help of one Bob Schmidt from Fear the Fro podcast to help me answer what might be the most complicated question Kobe Altman and the Cavs front office face all year long. Hi, and welcome to the Sports Ethos Cleveland Cavaliers podcast. My name's Zach, and I've been described by some very kind and gentle people in the YouTube comment sections as an NBA nerd, among other things. So now, thanks to the fine folks at Sports Ethos, I'm here to nerd out about my favorite team, the Cleveland Cavaliers, with you. And today we shall embark on a journey to prove our 10th grade math teachers wrong that you truly can learn while sleeping. Don't be alarmed, though, ball knowers. This one's for you, too. We're talking hoops, backed by stats and numbers you've actually heard of. And you definitely want to hang out today because if you're a Cavs fan, which you are if you found your way here, you know Fear the Fro podcast. It's hosted by a man named Bob Schmidt, who has the best voice in the business, which is why he gets paid by Fox Sports. And he's the most creative in the business, which is why Fear the Fro is one of the biggest Cavs podcasts that, well, exists. And today, he's here to chop it up with me to talk trades. Bob, thank you for being here.
Zach, thank you for having me. That's a very kind intro. I'm glad to be here. I'm glad to be one of the early people on your pod here. So,
for starters, your podcast is, I personally think, the kind of like best blend of just pure entertainment and comedy mixed with actual like smart analysis, which is not an easy line to try to tiptoe along. And you have found that alchemy and balance perfectly. So kudos to you.
thank you. Thank you. That's very kind. It is tough striking that balance sometimes, but in general, the nice thing is the people who are listening to it are all, mostly as obsessed about the Cavs as we are, because it's a very, very niche subject to carry an entire podcast day after day.
It is, and there's so many of them. I don't know
Yeah.
how many teams in the NBA have more quality podcasts to choose from than the Cavs. So I chose the most saturated waters to try to dive into and bring some semblance of competence to.
I hear you. I hear you. But hey, you got to talk about what you love, So busy or
Exactly.
not, there's room for everybody.
Exactly. We can only hope. So I have asked you today because I have heard you break down the CBA and the new apron implications before, both on your show and recently when you went on to It's Cavalier with Mac. And the way that you understand the apron and articulate the implications of potential moves and things like that, I think is about as good as I've heard anyone do so, including the great Keith Smith. So I knew if we could swing this, that was like you were the perfect person to have this conversation with and make it actually make sense. We're not just like firing up the trade machine and saying, "Hey, this works." It's what can the Cavs actually consider, and what should they, if anything, consider making a trade this season?
Cool. Yeah. I'm happy to talk through all sorts of stuff. And I love Keith and all those guys. But yeah, the nice thing is we can focus almost solely on the Cavs. So where those guys, they have a lot of teams to cover and limited time to do
Yeah.
it. Our focus is primarily on the team that we care about. So happy to do it.
I want to start with the recent reports. I guess it was probably about a week or so ago now. I think it goes back to Chris Fedor. I saw it on Cavalier Nation that there are executives around the league that are expecting the Cavs to make a consolidation, like a 2-for-1 deal, with a couple of reasons, I guess, behind that. One being just the fact that they have so much depth and potentially too many guys for Kenny to choose from, and he's not going to be able to play them all. And also that they are going to want to duck under the luxury tax line. What was your initial reaction when you kind of saw and heard that go around?
Well, I mean, I think I had a couple thoughts on that. The first is when I see an article that says, rival executives, I think you have to take it to a certain degree with a grain of salt. Because again, this is essentially we're putting our trust in people who aren't making the actual decisions to have a good idea of what the Cavs would do. And I get why they would say it from the standpoint of we're barely over the tax threshold. It wouldn't be that difficult to get under it if you're willing to sacrifice a piece and find a team who can just take on a salary to allow you to send somebody out to get, because it's only 1.7, 1.9, depending on the sources that you go to, above that tax threshold. That's basically one minimum level player. If you can find somebody to absorb that, then you can get below it. To the idea that the Cavs are desperate to do that, I don't think that's necessarily the case. I understand why the Cavaliers or why Dan Gilbert would want to be below the tax if it didn't come at a cost to being competitive. Where I don't know that I feel as confident that that's a priority now is we had all these conversations in the offseason about how the Cavaliers, they didn't want to start that clock. They didn't want to get into the tax before they needed to. They didn't want to get into the first apron or the second apron if it wasn't, absolutely necessary to do so in their ascent. It's pretty obvious now, based on where we sit at Christmas, that this Cavalier team, if they don't view themselves as contenders, then I just don't think they have enough self-belief, because where this team is now, it's not where anyone expected it to be. So I think logically you can look at a team that's super deep, that can't seemingly find minutes for everyone, and say, okay, yeah, they may dump someone to get below it. And sure, there is a difference in the sense of you get below that luxury tax and you become one of the teams that gets a payout. And a payout to a team that's a non-taxpayer team could be anywhere between $15 and $20 million this season. So that's significant money to line Gilbert's pockets. It doesn't make any tangible difference to the actual Encore product. What you would need to sell to fans in that scenario is, well, listen, we did this because it's financially prudent, but it doesn't necessarily help our basketball competitive landscape. And the thing I would say, any Cavalier fan who was here last year knows that health is not guaranteed. Do I agree that we're deep? Absolutely. But we've already seen stretches of basketball where we were without Karis LeVert, and Ty Jerome had to play an elevated role in the offense. We've seen injuries to basically where things have been different this year is that we haven't seen those injuries really accumulate to the core four. But the bench has had plenty of injury issues and is still going through stuff, with Dean missing, our most recent game, with Isaac still out for a period of time, with Max just getting back involved. I count ourselves lucky that we've been as healthy as we have, because while we've had injuries, they haven't been as detrimental as, last December. In the span of 24 hours, we lose Garland and Mobley for long stretches. So this idea that we're too deep, I don't think there is such a thing, because you simply don't know what's going to happen. Think how different our outlook would be if all of a sudden Allen or Mobley go down. It would be completely different because we're shallower in the front court. So I understand this notion that if there's people that the front office knows, okay, we're not bringing them back. And when I say people, there's 3 unrestricted free agents heading into next summer, that being Karis LeVert, Ty Jerome, and Sam Merrill. If the front office already knew that they weren't going to try to bring back a Merrill or a Ty Jerome, then yeah, maybe then in that situation, you look to move them now to get under the cap. But the difference here is a lot of times in these situations where you're dumping someone to get under the cap, or the tax, you have to incentivize a team to help you do that. It's so this idea that they're going to give up potentially a contributing piece. Now, if you could dump, say, like a Tristan Thompson and then cycle 10 days until you convert a contract like JT Thor, I'd feel differently about that. But just this notion of dumping a guy to get under the tax for the sake of saving Gilbert money, it doesn't make any difference on competitive balance, because, and this is the other thing, I don't know that everybody makes the distinction, getting under the tax this year, it doesn't change where we'll be at the beginning of the offseason. And that's what determines what you have available to you in the terms of exceptions and things of that nature. We're positioned to be, well above the first apron, looking at probably second apron if we bring Karis or Ty back, either one of them, because we're roughly, right, not to get too dense into numbers, but you're talking about heading into next offseason with 10 guys on active contracts with free agents in Sam, Ty, and Karras, and with about $15.5 million until we hit the second apron. So just to bring Karras back at the contract he's on now, we'll put the Cavs in the most punitive element of the apron. So I understand the desire to shave money, but more in the offseason sense. When you're trying to avoid the punitive parts of the CBA, being under the tax threshold does nothing for the competitive element of the basketball team. That's what I would say to that. So would it make sense logically if you're on the outside and you say, well, this team is super deep, they're right there above the tax apron? Because a lot of teams do that. A lot of teams dump guys in order to get below it right at the threshold. But this Cavalier team should not be operating as somebody who's concerning themselves with that, in my opinion. In my opinion, that should not be a priority if it comes at any type of cost to your ability to contend. And it potentially could if you got a few more injuries. So is it impossible? No. Do I really think it's a huge priority for this Cavs team? Not really. I think the fact that Fedor put in the fact that it said rival executives. I mean, I said this in one of the Cavs subreddit threads. How many times have we seen people cite anonymous sources or executives around the league, and then that stuff doesn't pan out? Or it's what people say when essentially it's a prediction. Because there's no, if it doesn't happen, it doesn't harm Fedor. It was just reports about what people said him. So there's no reason not to put that in print because there's no potential cost to your credibility if you're the reporter putting it. It's just, okay, these people from the outside said they think this may happen. They're no more in the know than some of us are. The people we should care about are when they're sourcing, it's sources within our own front office. And that wasn't what Fedor said. So I would take it with a grain of salt. I think financially it makes some sense, but I don't think it's worth the cost of the perception hit with the fan base. Is if they feel like we dumped somebody productive to save a few bucks, is it really worth it?
Is just literally a benefit to Dan Gilbert's
Yeah.
pocket. And it doesn't, and being a, say they are, the phrase has always been starting the tax clock, that we've heard. Being a repeater in the tax doesn't have implications of being a repeater in the aprons
No,
with
the
all
thing is,
that
a lot
stuff.
of times
So
they're
it's like,
correlated. There's usually
can
a
be.
strong
Yeah,
correlation, but they're not the same thing. And that's the thing
right.
that people don't always make the distinction is like, yes, there is a repeater element to you're going to pay a more dollar to dollar
Yeah,
cost, which again, though, that's only the financial restraint. The thing is, usually once you're deep into the tax, you're probably getting deeper into the aprons too. So the
yeah,
thing we want to avoid the repeater element on is the second apron situation, because that's the one that involves that freeze your pick, can't trade it, then eventually move it to the back of the round. Those are much more
exactly.
real to us as fans and our need to have some sort of hope for the future. Those are the things obviously we all want to avoid, but I can't think of a single fan that really, outside of the ones who have equity stakes in the Cavs, should care about the repeater tax from the sense of the financial element of it. It's just, you can't really, a lot of times there is no real separation because one is going to lead to the other. But this idea that like this year being 1.9 million over the tax, I don't care if Dan has
No,
to write a small check, and I don't care if he gets the 15 to 20 million if he manages to duck under it. What I do care about is if we go and we offload somebody like a Ty Jerome or a Craig Porter Jr. who's cost control for a few years, only to then suffer an injury where we have to start cycling 10-day guys and we don't have people to fill those roles. Because I consider ourselves blessed this year. You look around the league at what the injury situations have been, and I
ugh,
don't think you can make decisions with your current health state in mind. I think, if anything, what the Cavs have experienced the past couple seasons should make them more cautious than maybe other teams, because this has not been a team on the right side of luck when it comes to health, especially amongst their best players. This season, we just, I'm knocking on wood. I hope it continues, that it's been mostly guys who we can absorb the loss of.
yeah, yeah, absolutely. And it's back to you mentioned perception. It's not the thing that you do if you want people to take you seriously as a title contender.
Yeah, I do
Like
think
it's
some
not the
people
move
would.
that you make.
Yeah, I mean, there's still people who question if Dan will pay the tax now, even though he's paid it in the past, because there's just this baggage that comes with being a small market team that I don't know if it's worth. I don't know if it's worth it just for that financial reward. If they do it, it's going to depend on who would go out as to my feelings on the situation. But I really think that rival executives are just looking at a spreadsheet and saying, okay, logically they could do that. Sure, they could. But this team is also sitting at the top of the league. And I don't know if they're like, take Tristan, for example. He's not exactly that useful from a playable perspective. He's probably one of the guys who's in that salary range that I wouldn't be devastated if we lose him, but he's such a critical component to the camaraderie and the locker room that, again, you have to
Yeah,
ask, is the juice worth the squeeze, so to speak? Like, would it make sense to do that? And I think even then you'd have to question it, because the last thing I want to do is change anything from a chemistry, from a morale standpoint. And if you've got to go into that locker room and tell every other guy, okay, we took the vet on this team and we dumped him so that Dan could be, more rich than he already is, it's a tougher sell.
yeah,
You've got to have some people doing double duty in the media to really spin that in some type of way. And I think they've convinced a lot of fans that it makes all this financial. We don't want to start the clock, and it's like that should be meaningless to most of us. The only thing we
yeah.
should care about is the repeater when we get into these apron situations. And sadly, that's in some ways that's kind of unavoidable. Like, the reality is, I think people need to brace themselves for the idea that with the way Karras is playing, you're damned if you do, you're damned if you don't. You almost can't afford to lose him, but to bring him
Yeah.
back all but ensures, especially after we saw what Caruso got. I mean, there's a good chance that if he's now the barometer of 30-plus-year-old players who are valuable contributors on contending squads, the guy just got $20 million a year. I was hoping that, due to Karras's age and the fact that not many people are going to start a rebuild around him, that we can keep him close to what his salary is. But even a tick over 16 million, and we're in the second apron, and that's when things get really difficult. So
Yeah.
I think people just need to prepare themselves for that. And that's also why I know there's other things you want to talk about here. I'll let you,
Oh, you're
transition,
good.
but it makes a lot of those conversations, when we get into hypotheticals about people who want to bring back more money, higher salary players, why it
Yeah.
becomes difficult.
Yeah, it's for starters, I would like, just as a side note, the new CBA has killed the fun trade talks. Like, just the fun, fire up the trade machine, let's get hypothetical. You need a spreadsheet. I literally have Spot Track open on my other screen just in case. Like, you have to know all these intricate details, and you have to have like Keith Smith's graphic just like overlaid over everything that you do. And it just sort of, I mean, I'm as nerdy as it gets for an NBA fan, but a casual is like, wait, what? No. Like,
Well, I mean, even
that
me,
stuff is,
I think it takes years. I think it'll take, the thing that really drives the things in for you is when you see it play out in practice. And we're
yeah,
so early on in this CBA. I think eventually it will be second nature, but by that point, we might be in a new CBA negotiation. So there's a lot of stuff that people are just going to pick up as it happens to them, or it happens to their specific fan base. Like, for
yeah,
example, I mean, just this is something that I don't know that a lot of people consider. We get into these conversations about trading for guys, and guys that sign 1-year deals just have no trade clauses built in unless it's negotiated out, which in the case of Tristan Thompson, it was. So he could have dug in on that. I mean, but there are
yeah,
guys around the league who it's different for. Like, I know you brought up when you emailed me or when you messaged me about Cam Johnson stuff and some of the stuff that we've heard out there. Like, even I've heard the Grizzlies brought up. Well, Luke Kennard, who gets thrown into almost everything, he can veto any trade he wants. So because he's on a 1-year deal, and those are little things, tiny things that
yeah,
people don't even consider, but those could be deal crushing elements of these rules, because to sign a guy to a 1-year deal, he gets that built in unless you negotiate it out. Tristan had it negotiated out. Luke Kennard didn't. If you're
yeah.
Luke Kennard, do you want to go from the Grizzlies to the Nets? I don't know. It's going pretty well. I
No,
think they scored
yeah,
155 points last night or whatever it was. I wouldn't want
yeah,
to be offloaded. So
no,
there's all these things that are going to come up.
yeah,
But it's interesting. It's just one of these things that it is pretty convoluted as fans of the NBA to get used to this, and then to be on these cycles where these changes happen.
yeah, yeah. It's definitely gotten a little bit, let's just call it more complex. Uh, so before we jump into some of the hypotheticals, because I do want to get through some player stuff, because they could consider a move, and it would I think I think there is still merit to exploring whether certain things make any sense or not. But first, I didn't tell you we were going to do this because I wanted you to have to shoot from the hips on this. Um, I thought we could play a little game.
Okay.
We're going to do rapid fire, immediate reaction. Would you be willing to trade this Cavs player? And we're going to do the whole team.
All right.
Donovan Mitchell,
No,
Evan Mobley,
no,
Darius Garland,
no.
Jared Allen.
Probably no. I mean, I would only listen to it if I knew who the person on the other end was. But it would be a very difficult sell at this point.
Yeah. Max Struess,
I'd consider it.
Karis LeVert.
I would consider it. Primarily built around the fact that he has very little control left. My caveat there would be Harris is playing his best basketball. This is a terrible time to convince me that he should be traded. And it was part of that was the big focus of this whole Kuzma pod I did was people are talking about offloading a guy playing at his best for somebody playing near his worst. And making more money. Those are the situations where I'm largely hesitant. The only reason I would listen to it is because if you don't know what Karras is going to do in the summer, this is your last real chance before you get into the aprons and you can't do it to push that salary slot forward. But I still would be leaning towards no, unless, again, like with Jared Allen, you would have to convince me that something makes a ton of sense. And I just haven't seen much yet.
Yeah. Dean Wade.
I'd consider Dean, but the problem is salary. He doesn't make enough to return much of anything of value. I love Dean when he's healthy. I
Yeah.
will admit I get frustrated like everybody else that it's tough for him to stay on the floor, but we're super thin at the position and he's extremely value friendly contract. So for that reason, I think I could say, sure, I'd consider it without any real fear that anything could materialize that would make me want to pull the trigger.
Well, yeah, and I mean, one of the things that I've said in various places is like Dean Wade, for one, is probably more valuable to the Cavs than he is to pretty much anybody else, and he's a category one archetype of he's literally the only guy that looks like him on this roster. The
Yeah,
only one.
with that entirely. Especially that. I mean, I think that's a great way to summarize it. Dean holds more value to us, especially with our current roster construction, than
Mhm.
almost anybody out there would have for Dean on their current roster.
Isaac Okoro,
I'd consider it.
George Niang,
I'd consider it.
Jalen Tyson.
I'd be hesitant. I think, and let me just lean into the next guy because it's the same rationalization. Both him and CPJ fall into this category to me, where they're some of the longest extending contracts at basement dollars. So
Hmm.
even if they don't have a role now, especially as we get into these aprons and we're forced to choose between guys like that or just other minimums that are floating around the league to fill roster spots, to me, those are the upside, both financially and playing time guys who maybe they don't have a clear role now, but they still have room to grow as players and their contracts are amazing for the next few years. So those guys would fall into it would have to be, we'd have to be getting something of value that makes sense to offload those guys. Because to me, those are the hedges against getting pinched financially from the guys who are above them on the depth chart right now.
Sam Merrill.
Sam, I would. And I'll explain why. I like Sam, especially after this last game. This is a bad time to make this case, but I think we need to prepare ourselves for the reality that one of these three guys or two of these three guys that are unrestricted free agents this year will find their way off the roster if they demand a lot of money. Now, I think Sam is the guy who I'm least confident can drive his price tag up because I think, despite what we know as fans of his defense improving, of him being more than just the shooter, I do think he gets pigeonholed and labeled as that to the extent where people might just look at him and say, well, yeah, he's an elite shooter, but that's something that's becoming more and more in supply in the league. And we can find that for relatively minimal cost on the fringes in a way where being a primary create with the ball in your hand type player, like a Karis LeVert or a Ty Jerome, is a little harder to find. So Um, I think what's happened recently with both Ty seeing a little bit less playing time, that'll probably be good for the summer in terms of
Mm,
what his
yeah.
values at. With Sam, I don't know. I hope there's some built-in loyalty on both sides, but if Sam somehow played his way into, double figures, millions, that would be very difficult to retain all those guys. So I kind of hope what would happen though is if we're pot committed to one and we do actually show up in the playoffs like we're showing up in the regular season, that we just double down on all of them in the way that the Celtics did, where it's like, okay, if you're gonna screw yourself and be in the second apron, what's the difference between being in the second apron for one player and being in the second apron for another player? Because again, yes, there's a tax difference, but punitively, if you're $1 into the second apron or you're $10 million into the second apron, essentially you're facing the same restrictions. So if you could bring them back on deals that you think they're worthy of, well, then if we're doing it with one of them, and when one of them, I mean Karis LeVert, we might as well consider doing it with all of them. So, again, when I say I'd consider it for Sam, it's under this expectation on my end that it would not shock me to see one or two of those three get squeezed out just due to trying to keep some flexibility. Because I think if the Cavs can find themselves in a situation where they can stay at the top end of the first apron heading into next offseason, they will fight and claw to do that in the same way that they did in their negotiations with Isaac in terms of trying to squeeze every dollar out of that, even if it prolonged the situation.
Hi, Jerome.
Ty, I'd consider, but I just don't know, due to the not having bird rights and the being an expiring, if he has the kind of value that would make it worth it. Again, I think he's one of these guys where his play is far above his price point. We just don't have as much need for it when we're at full health. But to have a guy like that, it's such a luxury. I mean, the gap between he and CPJ right now is significant. So if you tell me we're gonna lose a Karis LeVert or a Darius Garland or a Donovan to some injury time in the future, then having a guy like Ty be able to step up there, I don't want to give that away for nothing. So
No, I agree with that. He's been my biggest shock of the season. That only leaves us with Tristan Thompson,
yeah,
which
I don't care. I mean, I
yeah,
mean, I care in the sense that again, the chemistry thing, that's all relevant. But to me, if you said, "Hey, just pick one guy that's going to get you below the tax because Dan's going to do it, whether you like it or not," Tristan would be the first one I'd go to. Absolutely, and then I would cycle 10 days until financially you can afford to convert someone like a JT Thor, and then I do that. That would probably be my pathway to try to serve both masters. Of fine, he gets what he wants, but I don't have to lose anybody that. And I know some people would make the opposite argument. They'd say we're deeper in the backcourt. Just suck it up. You got to deal with losing to CPJ or somebody like that. But I don't really want that, just because I know how much turnover we're going to get in the bench when we start getting squeezed in these next few years here.
yeah, I would agree. Of the roster that we just went through, there were three guys that I think have at least enough value potentially and make enough money that if the Cavs were to explore a move that could actually bring back something that might help them in their desire to be contenders, these would be the three guys that would, in some form or fashion, likely be involved in whatever trade that might be. And they're not shocking to anybody. It's Jared Allen, Karis LeVert, and Isaac Okoro. Those to me are the three roster pieces that you could build something around and actually bring back somebody that could move the needle potentially. So I wanted to spend a couple minutes on each of them before we look at some of the names that are out there as potential targets that we've heard or maybe have been rumored just wanting out, that kind of stuff. Um, it starts with Jared Allen. They did leave themselves about a 4-day window that he could be dealt by the deadline. I believe he's trade eligible on the 2nd of February. But to me, uh, this one doesn't make a lot of sense to me, because of a couple of reasons. One, like, what what's the deal that you actually put Jared Allen in that brings you back something that actually makes sense? It's probably a star-ish level wing, and then you got to figure out what do we do with a big? Like how do we then bring in a big? Because if you move Jarrett Allen, you no longer have somebody to stagger with Evan Mobley at the five. And I don't know how likely it is that it would be part of the same deal where you can go find that wing that really makes a difference and bring a big back that you would actually play at the same time. So you're probably talking about two moves there. And if not, if your primary target is a big or another guard, like why?
Yeah. No, I agree with you. I don't think it makes a lot of sense for all the reasons you said. One, I don't think we're particularly deep in the front court. I mean, we've essentially got three guys we're comfortable relying on, and one of them misses games at a high to frequent amount in Dean Wade. So this idea that we should be comfortable moving to Jared Allen without bringing another big back, uh, I just don't see it. And
I don't
on
either.
top of that, the extension he signed was so friendly that
Yeah.
you're talking about. I mean, Caruso at 30 plus years of age just got extended at the cost that Jared Allen is costing us now. And the other thing that I think is relevant in this situation is so many of the teams that we would be going to try to grab someone from, uh, does it make them better off getting Allen long term like this early in whatever their rebuild is? Most of the time, when people are offloading good players, players of the caliber that Jared Allen is already now, they're at the very beginning stages of a complete teardown. And what they're looking for is young guys on rookie deals and picks. It doesn't necessarily do them a lot of good to have Jared Allen captaining the Titanic throughout a period where he's going to be wasting most of his prime years in the middle of a rebuild. So I don't think that makes a whole lot of sense. Um, Obviously, he's one of our extremely valuable players. I just think he gets thrown around too much because Evan's taken such a huge leap, and those lineups where we've gone with Evan primarily as the center with spacing, they've worked so good this year. And I see all those things, but it's also worth noting Jared Allen is second in the league in true shooting percentage. I mean, it's the perfect scenario of, again, you know, could he do more if he was the primary person on another team? Sure. But with our depth situation, can we afford to move him? I don't think so. I think you're opening up one problem to solve another hypothetical problem that everybody feels we have. But just think back to last summer. How many people told us this pathway to what Evan had to do for Evan to make this leap? Did they take that conventional pathway? Did Evan just start bombing from three? No, he's taking more of them. But really, what changed his trajectory was getting the ball in his hands and driving downhill more. So, this idea that I think we're so fixated on this storyline that's continued for years of we need a 3-and-D big wing. And it's like, yeah, I would love one of those. But I think it's a very rare player who comes in and gives you more than you lose in what you're sending out with a Jared Allen.
No, I agree with that. The only one that made any the o- the only one that you could see making sense on both sides, and it is far from flawless, and also probably why it never got done, but you understood why the conversation was being had, was the Brandon Ingram for Jarrett Allen situation, because the Pelicans have a million big wings and they don't have starting caliber big, and the Cavs thought, the conventional wisdom in the offseason was that you had you wanted to put Evan Mobley at the five full time and you needed that big wing. Those were at least two partners that you could see coming to something. But
Yeah, and
obviously
now
it didn't
where we
happen.
are with the Pelicans, they're talking about
Right.
blowing up their whole team. And if I know a lot of that is just gauging the marketplace because they've had perhaps the worst luck of any team in the
Oh
league
my
this year
gosh.
in terms of injuries.
Hurst.
But if there's any truth to it, if you've got a team shopping Zion, shopping Brandon Ingram, shopping CJ, why are they worried about bringing in a Jared Allen? Jared Allen was
Oh
supposed
yeah.
to be the piece that completed a well-rounded starting five. Now
Right.
they're spiraling. I think the last thing they're concerned about is, okay, we need to round out this team so that we can claw back into what? The play-in, maybe? And on top of that, I will say I like Eve Missy. So I don't think that wouldn't keep them out of the market by any means. But I just think they're in a situation where what we were talking about in the offseason with them, similar to
Yeah.
us, in opposite directions. It's a totally different discourse at this point between where they
Absolutely.
were in the summer, where we were in the summer, and where both of our teams are positioned right now.
Yeah. Yeah. That leads us to Karis LeVert. He's you're in that trade him or resign him. And this one is just so hard because, like you said, over the summer, it made all the sense in the world if you would want to try to use him in your last chance to bring back value for him to maybe bring in a guy that's a bit more long term before Karis LeVert walks in the summer. But he's played so incredibly well. And realistically, for like not only what you would have to bring back at this point in time to feel like you're better than with Karis LeVert is just like so
And
much of a better player than it would have been if it happened in the summer. But also, when those conversations I think were prudent in the summer was before all of the extensions actually took place. Because
no,
now bringing back somebody that's like a long term deal, it just exasperates all of those apron talks, and you're not only pot committed, you are pot committed, and you've probably asked for a loan.
yeah. Well, I this is the thing I've said all along, which is, I said it earlier with you, is I'm not scared by guys on deals so long as those deals are relative values. Like
Yeah,
if the guy making $15 million dollars a year, if the guy making $20 million dollars a year is a movable contract in the future, then you'll always have outs to try to get out from the apron. What screws you is, and see, this is why I think the Oklahoma City thing is interesting, right? Because by committing to Alex Caruso, who's on the older end, when you compare
mhm,
him to the rest of that core, they're going to be faced with tough decisions in just a couple of seasons on the option years of Isaiah Hartenstein or Lou Dort, in a way where one of those two guys could get squeezed out. So are they going to squeeze out a younger guy because they committed to Caruso now, or are they banking on Caruso holding enough value as the salary cap increases that in his mid 30s at $20 million dollars a season, roughly, he'll be movable without having to bundle a bunch of picks with it if they need to, get frugal around the edges to avoid some apron consequences. And we have to ask ourselves the same thing. We're not going to be able to avoid the aprons, but if the guys we retain, they have to be retained on deals that will hold their value. And that's why what they did with Okoro, it makes all the sense in the world to dig in, because those are the less critical pieces. They're important role players for us, but you could absorb a loss to them if you absolutely had to. The thing you won't be able to do is move them if they're on terrible deals. So I'm not hesitant to pay Karras, but I think it has to be structured in a way where the deal isn't. I guess what I would say is we can't pay him just based off the results of this season,
yeah,
because paying a guy on what could potentially be his ultimate high point is never going to generally work out in your favor. I think we need to be realistic, but I think the market will force that reality upon Karras to a certain extent that no matter how good he's playing this year, the fact that units with he and George Yang out there together are some of the best analytically in all of basketball. I hope that there's some element cooked in of, okay, a lot of these results are coaching based and we can retain him because of his advanced age. I'm talking about him like he's a retiree, but like in basketball terms, the fact that he's above 30, that he's excelling in this system, but with a previous coach, he didn't have nearly as good of results, that
yeah.
we'll be able to get that perfect storm of A, him wanting to be here, B, not immense market pressure on the outside, and, C, our desire to contend will allow us to spend that money as we move forward. I actually think, honestly, in a conversation about trade value, I think Isaac is generally a more appealing piece to the type of teams that keep getting brought up in these discussions than is a Karis LeVert. Because we talk about Karas's value really is as an expiring to a lot of teams, who wanted to bring him in, who are trying to contend this year, but are facing these immense tax bills. Those are the types of teams who would look at a Karas and say, he serves us in the short term and he helps us in the long term with the money pinch that we're in now. A guy like Isaac is extremely young, still on the come up, and locked in at a very reasonable contract. The teams like the Brooklyn Nets of the world, those are the guys that they should want more so than a Karras, because they might actually be here and be productive when they finally climb out of the bottom and get to a more contending spot. That would be my contention anyway.
No, I completely agree with that. And that, that was kind of the point that I wanted to bring up with Okoro is that it I was surprised that a sign and trade didn't happen over the summer. Like it was just the way that that negotiation was playing. I'm like, this is gonna it's gotta be, what ends up happening. But instead, what happens is they get him to sign a deal that was at the time, you're like, okay, that's that's fine. And now he comes out here and he plays out of his absolute freaking mind. He can't miss from three. He's doing stuff out of the short roll that I did not think he was even remotely close to capable of doing based off of the play that he's shown in the previous couple of seasons in Cleveland. And now he's on like one of the most team friendly deals that's long term. This thing descends, I believe. Or if it does, no, his doesn't descend. It just doesn't really do anything. It's like 11 million basically
Yeah.
for 2 years after this year, and right now he's at what is it like 10.8 or something. So it's not, it doesn't descend, but it also doesn't ascend in like cumulative value. What are you and with that being so team friendly for the Cavs, it also doesn't do a lot of matching going out. You got to tie somebody else to him to bring back something that is remotely of value. So
Yeah.
that's where I think we're gonna go next is just kind of like talk about some of those names that are out there that some of them we've heard, some of them we wouldn't touch with a 10-foot pole. But before we do get into that, I do want to remind you all that this is a brand new show on the network, and we do need your help to get it to grow. So if you could please, at this point, if you are watching on YouTube, go ahead and hit the subscribe button down in this general region somewhere. Or if you're listening on a podcast app, go ahead and give us a 5-star rating. It would go a long way of telling the evil algorithms that it is worth putting this in front of people. Did you did you do it? Okay, thanks. All right, now Bob. Future editing, Zach, jumping in here real quick. This portion of the podcast was actually recorded several days in advance, which means that things have changed inevitably. A couple of those, as of this moment, are the Larry Nance Jr. injury and the fact that he's going to need surgery, as well as the Dorian Finney-Smith trade from the Nets to the Lakers. But I thought some of the points that Bob was making about those players and those player archetypes were still very valid and gave us a chance to talk about where we were, if those guys were potential options for the Cavs. So rather than cut them out of the podcast, I figured I would just jump in here real quick and say, disclaimer, yeah, some of this can't or won't happen, but it was still a fun discussion and hopefully enjoyable for you to see just where we were on those guys. I sent you most of these ahead of time, but I took a stab at compiling a list of, some of those names that could maybe be a potential target, or at least ones that we should check off the list as like, no, get out of here. The first one is the big one that I think we're contractually obligated to bring up because we talk about basketball. Jimmy Butler requested a trade on Christmas. Pat Riley said they're not going to trade him this season, so we can be very quick on this. I've got a big old fat no thank you for this particular player. What say you?
Also no. I mean, he's in that range of price tag that I don't think people should even be discussing. It's not realistic for us, on top of the fact that he's at the wrong end of his career arc for a team that is the core is relatively pretty young. It's shocking to me sometimes when I look up average age of teams. I'm like, well, we're not actually on the low end. But when it comes to main contributors, we're very much skewing towards the low end. So this idea of trying to get a guy who wants to be paid and needs to be paid, could walk away if he doesn't get what he wants, and is as injury prone and old as he is, that's an immediate no for me.
Me too. So we're going to go ahead and skip on that. I had a few notes about his tenure at some of these teams and why you would ever want to sign up for that, but we can skip that. De'Aaron Fox, he's kind of the flavor of the month, next star that's going to ask out. And to me, the Cavs already have what might be the best backcourt in basketball, if not like I've been looking at it. It's from what I can compile top three at best or at worst. in terms of where they could fall in that hierarchy of discourse. And I do not see a world where it makes any sense to swap one of them out to plug De'Aaron Fox in.
No, again, I mean, the Aaron, Jimmy Butler, Levine, these are all guys that I'm like,
Yeah.
these are out. Their price tags are out. And on top of that, I don't, I think we're talking about the wrong positions that people would be
Yes.
addressing. Anyway, I think we have better in house options already, many of them who make less money than the guys that are being discussed.
Yep. I would agree. The next name that I had, and this was one that I think made way more sense in the offseason as one of those potential Levert deals, and that's DeAndre Hunter in Atlanta. If you if you could bring back a guy who fits the archetype that DeAndre Hunter does and is locked up more long term, he is young enough that he could, fit right into this core. And Levert being an expiring could have had some value to Atlanta at the time, dumped, who had just made their deal that kind of signaled they could potentially be angling towards younger, bringing in a guy like Dyson Daniels and prioritizing that. And I wasn't totally sure what they were doing, but it turns out they were right to be doing it in a Dejounte Murray addition by subtraction situation of bringing in a guy that probably is what you thought you were getting in Murray defensively next to Trae Young and doesn't come with the oh I need to actually dribble that uh, Murray does. So in that context, he was a guy that I was really interested in them at least kicking the tires on. It didn't seem like it was happening, and maybe there were conversations, behind the scenes that we just didn't hear about. But at this point, both Levert and Hunter are playing their best basketball of
I
their
think that's
entire careers. So like we'd probably both be happy if things had flipped and it happened then, but it sure as heck isn't happening now.
I agree with you. I think that point you just made, it's a very similar parallel. It's like people, yeah, a lot of people talked about offloading DeAndre Hunter last year. And now
Yeah.
this season, unbelievable. 44% from outside the arc, 20 points a game. And every year that goes by, the contract gets more and more reasonable. On the front end of it, it was absolutely terrible. But they made the right choice in offloading Herter and keeping him, and it's working out. And like you said, addition by subtraction. Murray leaves. They don't get as much offensively from a Dyson Daniels, but between what he's picked up in his season, his career year for DeAndre Hunter, and then
Oh my
Jalen
gosh.
Johnson being able to take on an assumed role, that's it. It's an exciting team of long wings and a lot of
Yeah.
versatility. So I wouldn't be looking to. Yeah, if I'm the Hawks, you're going to have to. It's like a pry him out of my cold dead hands. It's got to be a move that would
Yeah.
make absolute sense, and I don't think it makes sense for either party here. So
No, no, not anymore. But a hawk that does make sense, or could at least, is Larry Nance, bringing him back to Cleveland. About 11.2 million is not the easiest to trade for if you're the Cavs, based on what would potentially have to go out. But he is a big local guy. He definitely wouldn't hurt the vibes of this team, which is something that matters. Like when you've got a team playing this well and you're considering a move to bring in anybody, like could this throw things off? Like he's a guy that is not going to have any any difficulties there. He's not a direct Dean Wade, replacement in role by any stretch, but he does have some elements of what Wade brings, that he can do to some extent. And I'd say I would like to have him, but I'm not sure if it costs like a Coro. I don't know that I want to go there. But if there's a
I feel
different like
I'm
yeah,
in the same boat as you. I like him as a player and a theoretical fit, but the problem is everything that it would take to bring back him in a deal is not really stuff I'm eager to move. And on top of that, I don't know that it makes sense for a Atlanta team to say. And I get there's some ties there, Okoro and him being at Auburn and all that in that region. But that being said, I don't think that's really something that they're prioritizing. They have a taller, presumably bigger terror on the defensive end and Dyson Daniels right now. Do they really need that And I think there's an element of them that's holding on to Larry Nance Jr. with the expectation that they would love to get out from under Clint Capella if they can find somebody to absorb
Yeah.
that. Yeah, so in that regard, I don't think he's not playing a lot this season. He's under 20 minutes a game, but I think there's a runway for him to be more. And in terms of retainability at his age, if he could fit there, who knows? Maybe that's a place that would bring him back on future deals. And when he has played, I mean, he had that game earlier in the month where he knocked down like 5 3-pointers and went for 20 and 10. So, and that was the only game that I can think of where he eclipsed 30 minutes this season. So I definitely think he's one of those guys, similar to how we feel with Ty Jerome. Given the right opportunity, he can be very useful. I, of course, love him as much as any Cavalier fan. I just don't think I think that's more of a sentimentality target than it is one that makes sense for either team, especially considering what it would require financially to get involved in a
Yeah.
Larry Nance Jr. trade.
Yeah, because you could make the math work building something around Niang, but
Yeah. But why would
what,
they want? I mean,
yeah,
this is
what,
it just doesn't
yeah,
make sense. He's got a year
no,
left. He's very much a situational type player. I just it makes sense for us because we needed the spacing and we're very thin in the front court. But George Yang on a lot of rosters is not thought of as highly as he is here because we're so desperate for anyone
yeah,
to fill that vacuum of minutes. It doesn't exist in other places. In other places, like Atlanta, you have a bunch of young, ragey wings who you're prioritizing, and those are the guys you're going to want out there on the court.
yeah.
Ideally, you're not hoping to have to play a George Niang. You're hoping that your guys can shoot well enough that you can justify playing Risa Shea and Jalen Johnson and Dyson Daniels big minutes. So,
Yeah. The other name that gets brought up all the time, so we got to hit on it, is Cam Johnson. I think the idea of Cam Johnson makes all the sense in the world, and that's why his name comes up so much. But he's not particularly reliable. The most games he's played in his career is 66. You're actually really lucky if you get 50 plus out of him. I, I think Dean Wade might actually be more available than Cam Johnson is, and that's not particularly a compliment as we've alluded to earlier in this pod. He's not the best defender in the world. I think he would hold up okay with Mobley and Allen behind him, though. He can shoot. He's 28. He's got 2 years after this at 20 and 22 million. So if you do this, you're locked into him, probably. But like, are you making that long term bet on this guy? I'm not. Are
no.
you?
Well, I'll say multiple things. First of all, I love Cam Johnson as a player and a theoretical fit. The
Yeah.
the issue is two things in my view. One, we can't pour more money into the starting five. We are already weighted so heavily in that direction. It's generally that's not take the player out of it. Just moves that are going to consolidate multiple cheaper pieces, thin out our bench to put more money into a starting unit that already has super productive players. I mean, that do we need that just because his skill profile? It would be perfect in a fit situation. Yeah, the guy's amazing, 8th in the league in true shooting percentage, and he's the only guy besides Josh Hart in the top 10. And we know why Josh Hart's true shooting percentage is what it is because even though he's not technically a center, every other guy on that list is a center. Just Josh Hart and him in the top 10. And Hart's shot profile is incredibly different from a Cam Johnson. So for him to do what he's doing, I'm not taking anything away from him. Over his last 9 games, I mean, I don't know if you saw last night's Nets game when they beat the Bucks, but 2 things jumped out to me. First was, Cam Johnson has been on a tear, 24 points a game over his last 9 games. Shake Milton scoring 14 points in the fourth quarter. I was not expecting that.
Not have on that on the
But
bingo
for
card. No.
him to knock down that 3 at the end and get fouled, he absolutely would work with people. I think the reason we can dead this conversation as it relates to the Cavs, though, is because the Cavs don't have anything to offer that the Nets want
Yeah.
comparatively. We're talking about, again, deals that would be built around guys like Karis LeVert and George Yang. If the Nets get rid of Cam Johnson, it's going to be to try to get back young, cost-controlled guys on the upswing and draft picks. We can't compete on the draft pick front. We can't really compete on the young guy front. Just think of some of the deals that have been pitched out there. So here's some of the ones I've heard with Cam Johnson. We brought up the Grizzlies one before.
Mm-hmm.
They could use Marcus Smart's salary. They could throw back picks. I mean, that's something that they have more picks available to them than we do. So they could absolutely be in play for that. But then this is one I like. This is my if you were to make me in charge of Cam Johnson's future, what I would do if I'm the San Antonio Spurs is I would go to Brooklyn and I would say, listen, take your pick. Keldon Johnson, he's got 2 years left after this. Harrison Barnes, he's got a year left after this. Them, just by themselves, match the salary. Now, if I'm Brooklyn, maybe you lean towards Keldon because he's a little younger.
Mhm.
He has a de-escalating contract. The next couple of years, his contract actually goes down. He'll be making about $17.5 million. They have a ton of first-round picks to play with. They have up to 4 in play for this next season. Now, most of them aren't going to convey. They have Charlotte's, which is unfortunately protected 1-14, and with the way the Hornets are playing, that's not going to convey, and it's going to turn into a second-round pick. So it's a fake first-round pick. But then they have, I believe the other teams are Chicago. It's protected 1-10, and that rolls forward into the next few years. They have Atlanta's unprotected next year, and they have their own. So the Spurs could give them this reported, 2 first-round pick package that they want, but one of them would probably be a fake pick, or they'd
Mhm.
have to wait for it to convey. And they could match the salary fairly easily. And to bring in a guy like that, the Spurs are not a good outside shooting team. So if they could add a player like that, I think that makes more sense for both parties involved. I've heard rumors with the Kings of, okay, we want to send you Herder and we'll throw Devin Carter at you with some first round picks. Again, Devin Carter, who knows? It's a lotto pick. I loved him as a prospect. Obviously, the injury happened, so we haven't really got to see him, but you could get some legitimate first round picks from them potentially that if I'm looking at the Cavs and their minimal draft assets to send that are far in the future, and I'm also looking at a Cavs team that has a pretty young core and is destroying people, I don't know if that's the bet I want to make. I think there's a lot of avenues where they can get back what they really want so much easier from anyone but us. We always talk about what works from a money perspective, but I think
Mhm.
the easiest way to dead a lot of these proposals is to consider what the other team is looking for. And
Yep.
almost nothing that we're offering up in these hypotheticals is something that's a priority to the Brooklyn Nets.
Yeah. Definitely not for Cam Johnson. They have another guy, and this is the guy. To me, if you're taking a swing, you might have a dance partner, and that's Dorian Finney-Smith. He is that big versatile wing. He's 6'7", 220. He plays that 3-4 position, which is the one that I think to me is the most the biggest opportunity on the roster because again, the only one you have right now is Dean Wade, and he misses about 40% of the season consistently. And so if you could do anything, I still think that's the thing to plug in. He's shooting the lights out this year. He's a career 36%. And I credit Mikey McNuggets for bringing this up before me, but pointing out that he actually gets better in the
In the
playoffs
postseason. Yeah,
historically.
he's been good in the postseason. I think that's what so
Exactly.
much of it is propped up on, though. And
Yeah.
I I'm just not as high on him as so many people are because of the relative lack of contractual control that you have.
Hmm.
Although I do think he's opting in to the 15 million that he has next season. And again, what it would take to match that deal. I think Dorian Finney-Smith is one of these guys who people spent so much time selling his value when the Kyrie trade happened because it looked like essentially they just gave away Kyrie for nothing. And people were
Yeah.
like, well, this is the ultimate role player on this super team friendly deal. And I like Dorian Finney Smith, but I'm sorry. In the matchup we played against them this season, I think he's one of these guys who you can go through a whole game and there's plenty of games throughout the season where you don't even notice his contributions. I'm not in perfectly serviceable defensive player, can hit an outside shot, not going to get to take a lot of them over the course of the game. I just think he's one of these guys who, yeah, if you found a way that he could be brought in for the cheap price, I don't think he's going to recoup a lot of draft assets. I think what we saw in the Dennis Schroeder deal is similar. They might get a couple of seconds. They might get a fake first that everybody knows really is going to become second. But the problem then is the salary matching. And even, I mean, shit, even George Yang. If you told me, okay, you've got to grease George Yang to bring in Dorian Finney-Smith, who could walk away in the summer, that's not blowing me away. I mean, I wouldn't, I could deal with it, but by the same token, I don't think it's kind of the same feeling I have about Larry Nance Jr. and that he's in that contractual above 10 million, below 15 million. That's kind of a tough no man's land for us. You almost have to find guys who can work with dudes who you're more willing to offload because George alone wouldn't match him. And if you
Yeah,
told me you're going to give George and a Dean Wade, no, I'm not. I think Dean Wade, when healthy, is as good as Dorian Finney-Smith for this team, given the continuity that he has and that he already has played within this system. We know he can be a seamless fit if he can stay on the floor. The idea that I'm going to gamble all that for a Dorian Finney-Smith, who you could have a half year of before he decide if he plays great, what's to say he's not up? I'm taking my option. I'm out. I'm not as high on Dorian as so many people are out there. I think he's going to be somebody's consolation prize. Now, those scenarios where people talk about stuff like Dorian with a Day'Ron Sharpe, more appealing to me. Two birds, one stone. You're getting an elite defensive rebounder who's on a rookie contract that you can at least squat the rights for. But for me, to put anything legitimate on the table for a Dorian, it would almost have to be in a construction like that, where you're addressing another issue at the same time because of what we just alluded to, which is almost anything you put together for him is going to be a 2-for-1. Because at this point, you're not offloading a Karras. You're not offloading the
no,
1-for-1, the Max Struces of the world for a Dorian Finney-Smith.
no.
And if you're going to have to go 2-for-1 for him, I mean, I would be more likely to listen if you could somehow squeeze a Sharpe out of there as a, insurance bet, a better long-term bet than a Tristan Thompson to serve as that utility 5 if things go badly from a health perspective with a Mobley or an Allen.
I agree, and I think the to your point earlier about even just thinking about, well, what would the Nets even want? To me, it's a package around Okoro and somebody else, probably Niang, and trying to bring back Dorian Finney-Smith and Sharpe, and or some other value in addition to
Yeah.
Dorian
And
Finney-Smith, and that's kind of what it is. And depending on and why I think this one could potentially have legs from a roster standpoint is because we have talked about the depth. We have talked about how they've got a bunch of guys, and all of those guys are kind of in the same lane of archetype of player. You know what I mean? They're not all the same. They're not all. It's not all just complete redundancy on the roster, but they do only have one guy that looks like Dean Wade. They've got multiple guys
I know what you're
that
saying. You're,
that
we
look like,
essentially
you
have
know,
a lot of guys who can comfortably slot the 2 to 3, less so who can
correct,
comfortably slot the 3 to 4. And I
correct.
totally see that. But even if you were to tell me, and this is, I get it, we all prop up our own guys, maybe a little
Yeah,
more so than other fan bases. But it's very tough for me to stomach the idea that we fought and fought to get Isaac to commit to this super team friendly contract, and he's the age that he is. I mean, nearly 10 years younger than Dorian Finney-Smith, and we're going to cash that in because, again, I mean, how much of the draft run up this year was guys wanted to rule out Tyson because he was 2 inches shorter than a Johnny Furphy, and meanwhile Tyson is a million times more of a big man than a Johnny Furphy. So this idea that we can
yeah,
and we have a proven sample of Dorian Finney-Smith. We know what he is.
yeah,
But I also think Isaac got thick as hell just as a young guy. I mean, he can guard bigger than his size. He's not a 3-4. He's a 2-3. I get that. I just would be hesitant because we know what he is for the next few years. And
yeah,
God forbid we cash him in for a Dorian Finney-Smith who falls off mightily or who walks away because he sees an opportunity to get more money that we're not willing to pay him. I'm probably lower on Dorian than the majority of people who have these discussions. I think it's one of these things where we're celebrating past moments. And I think we're on the back end of that really sustaining to the point where Dorian Finney-Smith at 50. I mean, think about the Detroit game that took place. We're recording this, I realize, but the Pistons game that they just won, where Malik Beasley, who gets brought in for $6 million a year, hits 3 3-pointers in the final 2 minutes. They come back from a double-digit deficit with less than 2 minutes left. Those are the types of guys that we saw out there on the free agent market. Veterans have
Hmm.
paying a veteran $15 million a year. I want him to have more of an impact on a night to night basis than Dorian always does. I think Dorian has the potential to make that impact, but not consistently in the way that somebody who I want to pay that amount of dollars to. That was the same criticism of Levert last year, is when you pay a
Yep.
guy $15 million, you don't want peaks and valleys. You want more consistency. And Levert has delivered this year. I think Finney Smith he's getting a serious bump amongst our own Cavs fan base due to archetype love and this
It's
desire to fill that archetype. And I just don't know if it's prudent, even if we do have a bit of a glut of guys who can serve the 2-3. I still think I would like to sit back, move it a little forward in the future and see, like, okay, Isaac's playing his value up already. What's to say that you can either believe that he's at some high point and we got to cash in now when he's number 2 in the league and 3-point shooting to Jokic, or you can say, listen, all we've seen every year is he's gotten better and better. We know he's on the ascending arc. We can't make that same case with a Dorian Finney-Smith. So you really have to believe he's the missing piece of our, bench in order to make that type of maneuver. And as frustrated as I am with Dean, I think if you told me I could have both guys healthy, but Dean cost me, $4.5 to $6 million, and Dorian Smith has walk rights and he's costing me closer to $12 to $15 million, I'm taking Dean Wade because I know what we can get out of him.
no, I completely see where you're coming from with that. I am guilty a little bit of having that archetype love, but to me, it's because I feel like we are over reliant on Dean Wade, and we have to caveat it every single time with if Dean's healthy,
But Zach, let me ask you,
and
if
that's the
I think here's what I would say. I feel
mm,
the same way, except that I think the avenue to address that is where I feel differently. I think that I would much prefer to wait to see what happens in the buyout market, because I think there's situations where you could address that, maybe not at a player as good as Dorian Finney-Smith, but as a successful handcuff to Dean Wade's health issues, that you could bring somebody in and he could address that, and it won't cost you anything in the way of trade assets. Because that's the other thing. Just as an overlapping theme to this whole discussion is we can't approach everything like we have these vast resources. If
with
we
so few.
expand our draft assets now, our flexibility is already terrible for the next 3 to 4 seasons with our lack of draft pick control. If we cash in the few that we have that are way down the line, well, that's it. There's no maneuverability. And everybody loves having trade conversations just for
Hmm.
speculation. Do you want to kill that in the year 2024? We haven't even hit New Year yet. It's one of those things where you got to be very prudent. Like
Yeah.
using draft picks, especially first round draft picks, which I know we probably would not have to use for a Dorian Finney-Smith, but putting those in.
If we did, I'm running
Yeah,
screaming the other
exactly.
opposite direction.
I
I
just
do want,
it has to be
I want to like contextualize. I am not so like high on Dory Finney Smith that he is just, some on some pedestal. I just of the stuff that's out there, because there are kind of so few to talk about. He has at least the conversation, to me at least, has legs, and there's also the element to it where, depending on the 2-for-1 that you do, you then go back to the first thing that we talked about in this conversation, which was, are they potentially going to do a 2-for-1 consolidation to try to duck the tax line too? And is that a potentially a a carrot that they are chasing in some of
right.
these? And there are configurations where you could do that with this and still bring back a piece that could have value to contender status, and you kill two birds, as opposed to literally just doing a salary dump and having to tell your fans, hey, we think we're contenders
Yeah.
without this,
No, that's an excellent point. You can
you
you can sell someone on the idea that they think he's such an ideal fit that
right.
the other value in the trade is you freed up a roster spot and you got under the tax. Oh, look at this. Now we can bring up a Travers or a JT Thor. I
Yeah.
mean, yeah,
You
I do
you
understand
can
that. I just
you
it's one of these things where I feel like he's benefiting too from, we know he's on a team that's just absolutely willing to
that,
fire sale pretty much anybody. So
that's
he
it.
gets a little more traction than other people who we may not know are going to be on the buyout market. So I'm kind of the
Yeah.
last thing I'd want to do is, and I think we saw it a little bit last year with Marcus Morris. You had these guys cash in, like who did I forget who the Bucks signed as a buyout guy? Was it Danilo? Yeah, I think it was Gallinari. And then
Mm.
Marcus Morris comes free, and I think
Mm.
he possibly would have been a better fit for them, but he hadn't shaken out yet. And so those are the types of things where I just kind of want to see what happens as we
Yeah.
get close to the trade deadline. I could be talked into a lot of things. And I know I'm probably coming off more, don't do anything. This, I love our team. Don't change anything. That's not necessarily my intention. It's just that I haven't heard a lot of things that I think more so make sense for the other team, given what we have to offer. So I shouldn't romanticize these top of the wish list guys like your Cam Johnsons and some of your other guys, because a lot of teams are going to want those and have more sensible packages to be able to send Brooklyn. Dorian Finney-Smith, I think sometimes because he's further down the pecking order, it makes more sense to talk about guys like that. But I could give like take it or leave it. It doesn't sway me one way or another. I could be talked into a deal under the right circumstances, but I've loved. I guess I guess what I don't want to lose sight of is it's so much easier in past seasons to have this conversation
Yeah.
because we clearly have holes. And now our bench is one of the best in the NBA, and several guys on that bench are having career years. I'm not looking to trade just to trade. You have to be able to rationalize the reason why it makes sense. And I'm sure there are pathways to do that. But a lot of these guys, especially the ones on the high end of the market, I'm like, no, you can't talk me into that. Doesn't make sense on any level. Some of these guys down towards the bottom, maybe. Maybe if they could be acquired with second round picks and people that we don't care about. But I care about everyone is my problem, Zach. I love this whole bench. I love the way they're playing, and I don't want to do anything to risk it.
Honestly, that's why I wanted to have this conversation now. And it's because we are in that spot. Like this conversation is honestly less enjoyable in my mind to have when it's that glaring need and we're just like shouting, we have to fill this, we have to get this guy. It's no, this is hard. This is difficult. There's not a single guy on this roster that I want to see out the door. Not one. The closest thing you might be able to twist my arm with True Serum and say, is there anybody on this team that you're like, yeah, get rid of that guy that plays is like I I don't always love where we are with how much we have to play George Niang. Okay, I don't always love that so much, but I don't want him gone. I love what he does in this locker room. He seems to bring like the perfect mentality. I just wish he didn't play as many minutes. We didn't have to. Like there's no one. There's nobody I want to see go away. But to me that also it doesn't shut the door on are there pathways to taking this team and saying, okay, how do we make it more of a championship contender? And what potential things could we see being a problem come playoff time? And
Well, yeah, I think
and
that's
what this is the time that it can be addressed, right? Is
I think
trade
that's a
season.
fair point. I think if you view things through the prism of it's not about a discontent in now. It's about
Right.
trying to ensure that we don't rest on our laurels and that we position ourselves the best for the long-term future. Because outside of these three guys, like basically everybody on our bench, I mean, we alluded to it earlier in the conversation. Jalen Tyson's locked up for a long time. Craig Porter Jr. has a reasonable amount of years left. But every single other player will cycle out of his contract before the core four does. So we're talking about we'll have decisions to make on every single player on the bench. So there will be conversations that have to be had just for the sake of extending this window for our guys as long as possible, even if we are what we're seeing out there on the court right now. So I don't think you cannot have the conversations. I just think people always want it sooner rather than later. And
Mm.
and especially with Kobe, there was a lot of criticism. Think about how much he's been killed in past seasons for not making moves at the deadline. And think about what if he had fire sale Karis LeVert. We wouldn't be experiencing any of this right now. So there are times where it's worked out being patient and deliberate. And
Mm-hmm.
of course, worked out in the offseason with bringing back the core four and running it back. I think Kobe has earned the benefit of the doubt here. And if there's anybody thinking of angles that we aren't when it comes to these 2-for-1 things, that's the thing I'll say about Kobe is we talk about all these different avenues I don't doubt for a second that he's considering and has considered everything. It's just one of those scenarios where I hope people aren't taking for granted this window that we've seen with what Kenny's gotten out of guys who maybe previously were out of favor with many of us. Because I'm not saying that the performance, the area that they're performing in now is 100% what they will be forever. But the fact that we've seen positive growth from almost everybody across the bench makes me feel like I don't want to take it for granted that they were better players than we saw in JB's system. I don't want to pull the ripcord on the parachute before we've even jumped out of the plane type of thing. So in that situation, I couldn't be happier about what we're seeing. But I'm also not so foolish as to think that we can make all of our decisions based on where we are today at the end of 2024. We've got to be thinking long term, especially with the financial difficulties will exist in these aprons.
Yeah, I totally agree. We've gone a little longer, so I don't want to keep you too much longer. I'm just going to say a couple of names and let me know if anything moves you real quick. Denny Advia in Portland.
I mean I like him as an archetype, but I think he's kind and in some ways I'm like he's sort of at a sell low point. He hasn't fit in there as seamlessly as I would have expected. I thought he was going to have a monster year. I like him. I like his contract, but again, he's in that mid-teens range where it's you're talking about possibly the guys you're putting in for a 2-for-1. Maybe I could be talked into it. The thing I do like about him, I'll say this, is he is younger, and I think he
Mhm.
has a lot of those complementary skills in terms of he rebounds well, he can move the ball a little bit. I know that he hasn't been a sniper per se, but I think a lot of guys have shot above their career averages with Kenny, and I don't doubt that he could probably outperform what he's doing in Portland in terms of shooting wise here. So I
That
don't hate him, but I like him as a prospect. Again, the details of the deal are where a lot of times things go south.
that deal does descend too.
Yeah, that is nice.
So
That
that's
is nice.
that could be helpful. Corey Kispert.
Love his profile. I think in that situation though, I might gamble on Sam being back, being able to provide much of the same stuff. I think Corey he's got more size. He can do a lot of stuff, complementary skills with the ball. I think he's better at creating for others than he's given credit for, but I think Sam takes huge leaps in that this year in a way that makes me want to be like, okay, do I think Sam's going to cost us 13, 14 mil a year or whatever Corey came in at on his extension? I think he was what, 3 for 36, somewhere in that range, 12 to 14 million. But I guess I would say I don't know. Sam might be able to do most of what you can do at a much lower price point.
Yeah, he's at 5.7 million right now.
Yeah, I know he
Um,
signed the extension though, because that was the thing.
yeah,
When I thought he might be a Dayron Sharp style dump at the end of his rookie contract from a team that was going to prioritize youth, that's when he was much more appealing to me. I still think he's on a very reasonable deal on his extension that he just signed, but
yeah,
the issue is essentially, how much can we really put in dollars wise into bench players? I like
yeah.
him. I like him a lot as a player, and I think he'd be very good in our system. I'm just hoping that when Sam hits unrestricted free agency, he's put in so much time in this system that I think he's really the only one you can look at and say, okay, he's having a down year from an offensive perspective.
He is.
But still the leaps he's made in other ways defensively and creating for others, and he seems noticeably stronger to me. Like the amount of times people think they're going to go through his chest or power their way through the rim, and Sam holds up fairly well in a way where I'm like, I know he's older, I know he got into the league and got his opportunity much later, but to me I think he's going to be considerably cheaper than Corey Kispert. And Kispert, again, for as good as he is, you're not playing him as a four. So
No, and that
adding to that glut of guys who are all very good 2-3 options.
yeah, that was kind of my hiccup, and that was one that I had heard elsewhere, and I was like, all right, I kind of get it, but I've mentioned it before. I think we need another guy that can replicate Dean Wade. I don't think we need a slightly taller Sam Merrill or Max Strus. We have enough in that mold. Uh, Herb Jones was a name that I saw thrown around there, and I just couldn't like that was never going to happen. If the Pelicans made him available, it they'd get so much more than what the Cavs can possibly offer. I couldn't believe that I saw it, but I wanted to say the words out loud to you and let you react.
I feel exactly. I think you summed it up nicely. I'm not even counting him as an option because his deal's fantastic. He's young. He's a guy that even if they tear everything down, I'm not moving him if I'm the Pelicans.
Yeah. Any other names that you've either heard that intrigue you or thought of that intrigue you that you think the Cavs may or should be kicking the tires on at all?
I can't think of anyone off the top of my head. I mean, I know we talked about a ton of them. I'm sure guys will come up, but I think what I would say is just a general thing is that I tend to think lower in priority than the names that are exciting to talk about. I'm more interested in guys on the fringes who could be obtained without moving somebody of
Mm,
consequence within our system. I want guys who have so little value that they could essentially be propped up on a movable salary we don't care about and a second round pick or a couple second round picks. If when you get into that caliber of player that requires draft assets and something that holds playable value in the future, I think that's where we find ourselves out of a lot of conversations. At least realistically, that's the way I feel. I would like the one thing I'll say about Dorian is that's the type of guy who, not the prize asset on the team. Cam's the prize asset on the team. Somebody,
mm,
though, who's in a situation where teams are tearing down, who they're like, well, anything's better than nothing. We don't want useful players mean nothing to us. It just makes us win more games. Those
yeah.
are the guys that I think we should be monitoring teams for. And can I think of specific guys? Not really. But like here would be an example. Take Nick Richards, right? That's
Mm,
the type of guy. We had this conversation with the real Cavs fans guys, Smooth, and he brought up Duop Reed. That's another name. Guys who are on
yeah.
low dollar contracts, so they could be matched with some of our non-important players, and aren't we don't need a ton from them. We just need an insurance policy that we feel better about behind a Jared Allen or Evan Mobley injury than having to roll Dean Wade out there as a center and expect for him to hold up under the grind of having to
Yeah.
defend true physical big men out there. So those would be the type of things that I'm more curious to see if Kobe sees an opportunity to jump on somebody that's a very minimal cost, very little upsetting the apple cart when it comes to our continuity and locker room chemistry. Those are the people that I'd be curious about.
Well, I guess that's going to be unfortunate because as of right now, you've been hired by Dan Gilbert. Kobe Altman had to take a leave of absence, and the decision lies at your feet. Are you making a deal at this deadline?
I mean, knowing what I know now, I would say no. I mean, outside of yeah, I can't think of what would even be the most desirable thing for me. Because so much of it, I just don't think that we have the best package that people would want. So I think I would land where I told you earlier in the conversation, which is I am trying to focus much more of my attention on who might find their way to the buyout market than what we're going to be able to do at the deadline. Because I think time and time again, what we're going to find when these deals get executed is that we just look at it and say, well, I get it. I get why that team took that package. And we don't have to feel bad about it because we're going to look at what we could have offered and we're going to say, yeah, I get why the other team would have taken that. And then see, that's a good situation to be in because then there's nothing to regret. You can't regret things that you couldn't really get into the conversation for anyway. So that's what I would say. I say I'm not eager to do anything right now. Health could change that for me if we suffered some serious injuries. Sure, the appeal of it again would be because our flexibility gets less and less as we move forward into these aprons. This is the final year where we're operating relatively unimpeded. So,
Hmm.
in that regard, I get why you need to do your due diligence, but my answer would be no. I'd be sitting it out and I'd be trying to scour the buyout options.
Seriously, Bob, thank you for doing this. Please plug anything you want before you go.
Not just the Fear the Fro pod, man. If people check that out too, in addition to this podcast, I am always appreciative. And you can find me on socials at Fear the Fro pod and anywhere you listen. Just type Fear the Fro, you'll find it. So, Zach, I'm honored to be early on in this podcast journey for you. So thank you for having me on, man.
Yes, number one, man. There's a trophy that is not in the mail, but if I ever make one, it will be.
All right, fantastic. Well, thank you for having me, Zach. Appreciate you, man.
Yes, thank you. And if you made it to the end, please if you're on YouTube, rate the show 5 stars on a podcast app that you're using. Now that the episode is over, go ahead and open your app store and download the Sports Ethos app for one of the best blurb feeds in the business. Cavs players, fantasy tools, updates. It's all there. I'm Zach. That's Bob. Thanks for nerding out with us, Cavs fans.